April 8, 1943, Rabaul, New Britain Island, 2,000 miles northeast of Australia. The air vibrated with the sound of Mitsubishi Zero engines as Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka guided his fighter into formation. The sun burned white against the Pacific sky, glinting off the canopy as a swarm of Japanese aircraft patrolled over the fortress base below. Rabaul, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was the Empire's shield in the south. Beneath the pilots, ships sat anchored in Simpson Harbor, their anti-aircraft guns bristling like porcupine quills. Then came the hum, a low, steady growl from the east, growing louder with every second. Tanaka squinted toward the horizon. "Teki hikoki da! Enemy planes!" The call crackled through the radio. Within moments, the blue sky darkened with the silhouettes of American bombers, dozens of them, flying in perfect V formations. B-24 Liberators, their massive wingspans slicing through the sunlight, escorted by P-38 Lightnings. The bombers gleamed silver, engines roaring like thunder. To the Japanese pilots, it was an impossible sight. So many aircraft in one raid, flying with mechanical precision. "Impossible," Tanaka muttered. Just last month, they had shot down waves of U.S. planes over the Solomons, dozens falling in flames. Yet now, the Americans were back. Not just back, stronger, in greater numbers. The sky erupted. Anti-aircraft bursts dotted the heavens as Tanaka dove into the formation, tracer rounds streaking past his canopy. He fired into a Liberator, its wings smoke trailing out. But before the bomber even began to fall, two more filled its place. The endless waves seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. As the air battle raged, the Japanese ground crews at Rabaul looked up, mouths open. Each explosion, each burst of black flak only seemed to reveal more bombers behind. The Americans came in waves, relentless, disciplined, confident. Hours later, when the skies finally cleared, Tanaka landed his Zero on the damaged runway. The once bustling airfield now lay pocked with craters, black smoke curling into the humid sky. His crew chief ran up to him, sweat streaking through the suit on his face. "How many did we lose, sir?" he asked, unstrapping his harness. The man hesitated. "Too many. And the Americans. There were hundreds of them, sir. Hundreds." Tanaka stared past him at the burning wrecks of aircraft littering the tarmac. "Hundreds today, and hundreds more tomorrow." What none of them yet knew was that the Japanese Imperial Navy's intelligence section in Tokyo had already seen the reports, staggering production figures from intercepted American broadcasts and industrial summaries. The United States, it seemed, was building planes faster than Japan could replace its losses. At that moment, a single truth began to dawn on every Japanese officer. This was no longer a war of courage or honor. It was a war of machines, and the Americans had built a factory for victory.
May 1943, Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. A humid haze clung to the capital as Commander Shunchi Watanabe, a naval intelligence officer, stood before a wall of maps. Red pins dotted the Pacific, Midway, Guadalcanal, Rabaul, Bougainville, each marking a front now bleeding Japanese aircraft at an unsustainable rate. Behind him, typewriters clattered, and aides shuffled coded messages onto his desk. The smell of ink and cigarettes hung heavy in the cramped room. Watanabe's eyes moved to the latest U.S. production intercepts. They'd been gathered from American newspapers, radio chatter, and reports from spies in neutral territories. The numbers stared back at him like something out of a fantasy. United States aircraft production, April 1943, 8,995 planes. May, 9,600. June projection, over 10,000. He read the figures twice, then a third time, his hand trembling slightly. "This cannot be," he whispered. A younger lieutenant stepped closer. "Sir, we've confirmed it through multiple channels. The Americans are producing nearly 10,000 aircraft every month. They have new factories in Michigan, California, Texas, places we've never even heard of." Watanabe rubbed his temples. "How many aircraft can we build in a month?" "Perhaps 900?" the lieutenant admitted quietly. The room fell silent. The gulf was no longer a difference in skill or spirit. It was arithmetic annihilation. He turned back to the Mac, tracing the long supply line stretching from Japan to the Solomons. If this continues, Watanabe said almost to himself, we could lose an entire air fleet every 30 days, and they'd still replace theirs before breakfast. Half a world away, that prediction was already becoming reality. In Michigan, an ocean away from the Pacific Front, a new kind of battlefield was roaring to life, not of bombs and bullets, but of steel and sweat. It was called Willow Run, and it would change the very definition of warfare.
July 1943, Ypsilanti, Michigan, Willow Run Assembly Plant. The night shift whistle blew, and the air filled with the clang of metal and the thrum of conveyor belts. Floodlights blazed across the cavernous expanse of the world's largest factory under one roof. Inside, thousands of workers, men and women, young and old, moved with practiced rhythm. The smell of oil, paint, and hot steel hung thick in the air. At the far end of the mile-long assembly line, a massive silver shape slowly emerged, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the most produced heavy bomber in history. Every 60 minutes, one rolled off the line, ready to take flight, ready for war. Helen Thompson, a 24-year-old riveter from Detroit, tightened her gloves and leaned into the fuselage's side panel. Sparks showered as she drilled the final rivet into place. Her team works 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. There were no uniforms or ranks here, just overalls and a shared purpose. "My brother's flying one of these over the Pacific," she shouted over the machinery, "so it better not fall apart." Her foreman grinned. "Then we better build another one while we're at it." And they did. Around the clock. From above, the factory looked like an airstrip itself, an industrial giant shaped like an L, built by the Ford Motor Company. At full speed, Willow Run produced a new B-24 every hour. Conveyor belts carried wings, fuselage sections, and engines along the line just like automobiles once had. Except now, instead of sedans, the bay birthed bombers with 4 roaring engines and a 110-foot wingspan. Reporters who visited were stunned. They compared the place to a living organism, a city with a pulse of aluminum. On any given day, 40,000 workers swarmed its floors, hammering, welding, painting, assembling. Each bomber bore the hands of hundreds of workers before it ever reached the runway. They'd paint the nose, polish the gun turrets, and sign their names in chalk on the inside panels, a quiet ritual of pride before the plane's first flight. Outside, test pilots from the Army Air Forces waited in the cold Michigan dawn. Engines roared to life as one after another the Liberators taxied down the runway. In a single morning, a dozen of them took off, headed for training bases, for England, for the Pacific. In Tokyo, Commander Watanabe would soon receive fresh intelligence photos showing rows upon rows of bombers stretching beyond the horizon, proof that the U.S. wasn't just replacing lost planes, it was outproducing destruction itself. And in the skies over a ball, men like Lieutenant Tanaka would face the result. The next time he looked up, the sky would not hold hundreds of enemy bombers, it would hold thousands. February 1944, Espiritu Santo Airfield, South Pacific. Engines roared like a hurricane as wave after wave of American bombers thundered down the runway. Ground crews in grease-stained uniforms loaded belts of .5 caliber ammunition, fueled the aircraft, and shouted over the deafening sound of propellers. To a casual observer, it looked like chaos, but to those who worked here, it was precision. Captain Robert "Bobby" Mitchell stood at the base of his B-24, nicknamed Detroit Daisy. Her fuselage gleamed beneath the tropical sun, a bright pin-up girl painted on the nose. He climbed aboard, glancing out at the rows of bombers stretching far into the jungle. "We got 50 birds up today," his co-pilot said. 50, just from this base. Mitchell nodded, strapping in. "And that's just Monday." In the distance, transport planes lifted off. C-47s, C-46, and C-54s, hauling fuel, bombs, and spare parts to other islands. America's airborne supply chain now stretched across the Pacific, linking factories in California to forward bases in New Guinea and the Solomons. Every plane in the sky had a twin back home on the assembly line. Every wreck lost in battle had a replacement already on its way.
By early 1944, the United States was producing over 96,000 aircraft a year. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Fort Worth churned out bombers and fighters like clockwork. Airfields across the Pacific brimmed with Curtiss Warhawks, Lockheed Lightnings, and Boeing Flying Fortresses. For the first time, the Americans could fight and replace simultaneously. Thousands of miles away, in Tokyo, the reports reached Commander Watanabe's desk. He flipped through aerial reconnaissance photos showing endless lines of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in Hawaii, Australia, and the Marianas. His stomach tightened as he realized what those images meant. Japan's pilots were still among the finest in the world, but their planes were being replaced at a fraction of the rate. Factories bombed in Nagoya and Yokosuka struggled to produce even a few hundred new Zeros per month. Aluminum shortages, fuel scarcity, and Allied blockades choked the empire's industrial arteries. At a strategy meeting, an army colonel slammed his fist on the table. "We train our pilots for years, and they die in weeks. The Americans lose one and send another by morning." Watanabe said nothing. He only thought of those factory floors in Michigan and California, the endless rhythm of machinery, the civilians who labored without rest, a nation that had turned its assembly lines into weapons. For Japan, the numbers were not just statistics anymore. They were a storm, metal, fire, and smoke, rolling steadily across the Pacific. And by mid-1944, that storm would reach the shores of the Marianas.
June 19, 1944. Over the Philippine Sea, the morning sun glinted off thousands of aircraft, tiny silver dots rising from the U.S. carrier fleet below. The largest naval air armada in history had taken flight. Below, 14 American carriers steamed side by side, their decks launching fighters and bombers in rapid succession. The code name for this operation was Forager. Its goal? Seize the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, strategic stepping stones toward Japan itself. From his Zero cockpit high above, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka adjusted his oxygen mask. He had been stationed on Tinian for only a month, flying out of an improvised airstrip carved from coral. The base had already endured weeks of raids, and now the air raid sirens wailed again. "Enemy formation, bearing 070 degrees. So many, I can't count them," a voice crackled over the radio. Tanaka's pulse quickened as the sky filled. Hundreds of American Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers climbed into view, escorting swarms of heavy bombers. The formation stretched for miles. It was not a dogfight, it was a deluge. The Japanese pilots took off in desperate waves. Some planes had barely been refueled. Others were flown by half-trained cadets, sent aloft with only a handful of hours behind the stick. As Tanaka climbed through a wall of anti-aircraft smoke, he saw it. Lines of contrails converging from every direction, like rivers flowing into a single sea of fire. He dove straight into the maelstrom. Bullets shredded through his wing as tracer rounds lit the air around him. He fired on a Hellcat, watched it spiral away, then another filled its place instantly. Down below, American bombs fell in staggering numbers. Whole airfields vanished in geysers of sand and flame. The U.S. Navy pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter in the sky. By the end of the day, Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, the bulk of its trained naval aviators. The Americans lost fewer than 30. When the last of the smoke cleared, Tanaka Zero limped back toward Tinian. The runway was cratered, the hangars aflame. Ground crews waved him off. There was nowhere to land. He turned east, climbing above the burning island. Fuel was low. He looked down once more at the inferno that had been his base, then up at the endless blue sky filled with American planes still passing overhead. Formation after formation. As his engine sputtered, he realized with a cold mechanical clarity that Japan's defeat was no longer a possibility, it was arithmetic. He leveled the nose, flying toward the open sea, the fuel gauge sinking toward empty. Far away in Michigan, another B-24 rolled off the line at Willow Run. 1 bomber per hour, one symbol of a war machine that had turned production into power. The empire had been built on discipline and honor, but the Americans had built an empire of factories, and its heartbeat echoed louder than gunfire. Tanaka closed his eyes as his engine coughed its last breath. The Pacific stretched endless and blue below him. The war he had known, the war of men and valor, was over. What remained was a war of steel, and Japan had already lost it.